this brings us to our first conversation, and that's what we're going to call these. These are meant to be engaging conversations and to start us off in the right direction, to anchor the 1.5 days of these sessions. We have Marilyn Schlitz, and we're fortunate to find her. We've had few conversations, and very intriguing, to say the least. She is a social scientist who's brought a notion and an idea that I think is very worthy of our consideration, and obviously for CAFE, because it's completely tied in to our mission statement as well. She's the founder and CEO of Worldview Enterprises, President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Check out their website. It's ions.com, I think, .org. And a very highly qualified, competent bunch of folks that know a lot of stuff, worth checking out. Very insightful. She's a senior scientist at the California Pacific Medical Center, where she focuses on health and healing, and a board member of the Pacifica Graduate Institute. She's a leader in the field of consciousness. And as her title of our session is, Understanding Consciousness and Its Transformative Value for Social Good. And it ties into our mission. You have to begin with the self and then move forward. And then, as I already mentioned, Death Makes Life Possible is the latest achievement, and she'll probably touch a bit on that as well. So understand what it means to have a worldview, learn how we can transform our worldview, what barriers stand in our way, learn elements of transformative practices, and how we impact change in our lives and our organizations. There's a paper on everyone's table, a diagram, and she will be discussing that. We've put that out there in case you're not able to see it on the screen.
Good morning. I just want to tell you what an honor it is to be here. I'm grateful to be invited, and for all of my academic endeavors, the thing that I value most is friendship. And so I feel really honored. I think last night was an opportunity for me to meet some new people, to learn some new things, to understand things in a new way. And so I'm grateful for that and grateful to be here. So I think that the topic is really extraordinary. We live in this incredibly complex time. Never before have so many worldviews, belief systems, ways of engaging reality come into contact. And there are various ways in which we deal with that, as we've just heard. On the one hand, when we meet difference, it leads to conflict. There's an intolerance for a viewpoint that's different from our own. It may be within the community, it may be across communities, but all we have to do is pick up the newspaper to understand how widespread that intolerance is. A second response to these differences is co-option. One truth system attempts to trump another one, to take over the kind of constitution of a particular worldview. And we see this all over the world, particularly amongst indigenous cultures, where modernity has begun to reign its influence, and many of the ancient traditions are being lost in that process. A third response to this engagement is what I'll say is creativity. And it's creativity and the idea that we can meet difference and in that process birth something new is what is really exciting and what has propelled me over this past few decades. So I've been interested, as my bio slide showed, in this idea of consciousness and have been studying consciousness in various ways as an anthropologist in the field, as a clinician looking at clinical trials, as an experimentalist in a laboratory, manipulating variables and looking for outcomes. And so I have a deep appreciation for the complexities and the lack of understanding in terms of the consciousness community. If you think there's misunderstandings in this community, nobody agrees. I'm on a listserv, and they're just busy debating things that really there are no ultimate answers to. So it's a very interesting, rich kind of opportunity. So the area that I have particularly focused in the last 10 to 15 years is the idea of worldview. What does it mean to have a worldview? Where does it come from? What informs it? And what we know is that there are many facets that inform our worldview. But ultimately, our worldview is that lens of perception through which we see the world. It's what defines meaning. It's what defines who I am. It's what defines how I interact with other people, how I engage the environment. What is my purpose, my meaning? And oftentimes, the interesting thing about worldviews is that they're unconscious. They lie below the threshold of our awareness. And so there are all these like operating systems that influence us that we don't even have a conscious awareness of. And that's both a gift. We don't have to be constantly reflecting on everything, but it's also a limitation if we can't see our biases and our assumptions. So there is this idea that I have a worldview and it informs my behaviors, and there are things I can learn about myself to become more aware. There's also the idea that other people have different worldviews from myself, and oftentimes this becomes very complicated. But I think it's a kind of literacy. As we begin to appreciate the power of worldview, we begin to honor the diversity of worldviews that make up this very complex soup that we live in. And then finally, there's this idea that there is a worldview that is bigger than our own situated selves, and that we are embedded in a larger context, and that that worldview is capable of transformation and change. And so that's really what I've been studying, is how do we understand worldviews, how do we develop the skills and literacies to enable us to fully function as worldview literacy creatures, and then how do we begin to look at the barriers and the opportunities. So we, in the course of the last 15 years, were engaged in a very serious research project looking at transformation. It began one day when a very successful, no-nonsense businessman came to my office, and he wanted to know about an experience he'd had. His whole life had really been defined by making money, being successful, mastering the external world. He had, a family life, he had a commitment to his community, but it really was about the external aspects that defined his identity. And one day he was at a retreat, and he walked out on the deck, looked out at the Pacific Ocean, and suddenly had an epiphany. He had an opening that suggested to him that he wasn't just this isolated, successful businessman, but that he was fundamentally interconnected with everything, with all of the life, with nature, with the ocean, with the animals. And that in that process, it shifted his values, it shifted his sense of identity, and it gave him a new sense of purpose. It redefined his relationship to his work, to his family, to his colleagues, and ultimately to his sense of service. And he came to me because he wanted to know first, was there something wrong with him? Had he had some kind of weird experience, and if so, could I explain it? And secondly, if his experience was real and valid, have other people had that experience? And in that process, if we could learn about it, could we then teach people? Because this experience he'd had was so powerful, he wanted other people to feel it. And so we started to dig into the scientific and medical literatures, and what we found is that almost always these kinds of experiences were defined as pathological, aberrant, unhealthy, psychotic. And yet what we were hearing from this gentleman was anything but that. And so that led to, getting into some of the more esoteric literatures and looking at how these qualities that Richard Gunther experienced can really be life-enhancing and sustaining and positive in many different ways. And so that's the route we began to go down. And we invited people to share their stories with us. We collected thousands of people's stories about, have you ever had a shift in worldview? If so, what catalyzed it, what sustained it, and what were the consequences of it? How did it change our behaviors? From there, we began to convene focus groups, and we invited masters from different world traditions to come together and help us to understand, how do you teach transformation? And how do you help to encourage the sustainability of these transformative experiences? From there, we created a list of questions, 20 questions, that we then asked 60 masters from different world traditions in depth to tell us about. From that, we were able to create a change model that we were then able to calibrate through a survey study with 2,000 people. So I lay this background to say this isn't just something that I made up on my way here, but it's something that's really grounded in a tremendous amount of inquiry, discipline, and mutual sharing from different traditions. So the essence of this change model then comes from the idea that something must catalyze this waking up to our worldview. And what is that? How do we change our minds? In the case of Dick Gunther, it was an epiphany that connected him to his place in nature. But what we found in the course of our research is that almost anything can be a catalyst. We heard from a woman who was washing dishes, looking out the window, and suddenly felt this sense of unitive consciousness. We heard from a Vietnam veteran who had been on the battlefield watching his colleagues being gunned down. And he, in that moment, had the insight. He was a Christian man. He remembered a Muslim prayer. And in that moment, transformed his fear into a purpose for living. And that inspiration stayed with him for decades after. So it really can be almost anything that can catalyze these. But what often happens is that if people have these openings, it's very easy to put it down, because these worldviews are very entrenched, they're very fixed, and we are not comfortable changing them. And in fact, what we learned is that there are a lot of ways in which our brain is hardwired to resist change. We know from cognitive science today that there is something called inattentional blindness. The idea that if we have these expectations to see the world in a certain way, our brains actually don't allow us to see it differently. It takes effort. It takes willfulness to begin to open ourselves to the idea that perhaps the beliefs I'm holding are not fixed or absolute. And so there are these ways in which we have innate barriers to transformation. It makes the process challenging. But once people can awaken and acknowledge that they've had some experience that suggests they're not just an isolated, disconnected entity, but really fundamentally connected to their families, to their society, to the broader environment, and to our sense of the sacred and divine. Once people get this inkling that there's something more, they can begin to engage a process. And so we see here at the very beginning of the Fibonacci spiral, you have these noetic experiences. Noetic comes from the Greek nous, meaning direct knowing. William James defined it in the way I like the best, which is states of insight unplumbed by the discursive intellect, all inarticulate though they remain, and yet they carry with them a curious sense of authority. So they're states of insight. I have an awareness. I have an insight. States of insight, unplumbed by the discursive intellect. In other words, it's not something I'm figuring out rationally or logically. It's something that's coming to me from my deepest core. Maybe my soul is something that's triggering this, but it's not my analytical mind. So states of insight, unplumbed by the discursive intellect, all inarticulate though they remain. So these are these kind of ephemeral epiphanies that we lack language for. And we lack language in many different languages, although, oh great, thank you. The bottom one? Okay, thank you. We were talking about Rumi last night, and you know, somebody who is a poet who has direct access maybe has a language, but the average person is not Rumi, and we often fumble. So states of insight, unplumbed by the discursive intellect, all inarticulate though they remain, and yet they carry with them a curious sense of authority. These kind of noetic experiences can change our lives if we pay attention. And so that can lead us to the second part of this change model, which is exploration. We want to know, like Dick Gunther did, is there something wrong with me? Or are there other people who share these kinds of insights, who want to feel this interconnectedness? And so that can lead on a journey. The pitfall of exploration is it can become an endless process and doesn't truly come home to ground us in the new noetic insights. And so we see that there's both the positive of exploration It allows us to reach out and consider other points of view, other ways of engaging, as long as it doesn't become the end in and of itself. The thing that becomes very, very important, and which I'll spend a couple minutes on, is, in my 4 minutes left, is the idea of practice. And so people in every tradition described the way to bring home these noetic insights and this kind of transformation of worldview is to practice. And yet, as I mentioned, we interviewed 60 different traditions. And you find that there are very, very diverse kinds of practices. So what is it that's common across those different practices? We identified 5 elements. The first was the idea of intention. I have a desire to take these insights and live into them. And so I bring my intention to my practice. But we all know the road to hell is paved with good intention. And so we know intention alone isn't enough. We need to ground that intention. The second piece of transformative practices is attention. How do we begin to recognize that our attention and where we focus our awareness is grounded in our worldviews, is grounded in our assumptions, is grounded in old baggage oftentimes that limits our capacity to see things in a new way? Is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? That's a choice we make. And that choice is grounded in a lot of years of building habits. So intention, attention, and then repetition. We were talking last night about some of the neural complexities and the idea that we can train our brains just like a muscle to create new neural pathways. But that's not simple. It's not easy. It takes repetition. It takes the idea that when you go to a gym and you're working on a muscle group, it doesn't build overnight. You work on it. It becomes a skill set. We develop it. The fourth piece then is guidance. So I want to make sure I'm working the right muscle group. I want to make sure that I'm not holding the weights inappropriately, or in the case of a contemplative practice. I want to make sure I'm training my mind and my awareness in ways that are ultimately socially redeeming. And so guidance becomes a fourth principle. And that guidance may be a trusted teacher, a mentor, somebody who's been on the path before us, or it can be greater appreciation and access to our own noetic awareness. Because in truth, we know, we have a sense of what is right. We have an intuition about those virtues and qualities we wish to embody. Is it love, generosity, kindness, altruism, compassion, forgiveness? All of these qualities become very ephemeral on some days. But if through practice we can begin to embody them, then we have an opportunity to live them more fully. And then the fifth element is what I like to think of as acceptance. That the world is not necessarily going to change simply because we've had these noetic insights, but that we must accept the world as it is and then work within that so that we can become a catalyst for transformation. So ultimately then, people have this idea of finding a practice, building these new capacities, and harnessing their ability to engage the world in a beneficial way. The problem with practice is, again, it can become the end in of itself. And people can become very virtuous about their practices. Well, you know, I do this on this day, and so therefore I'm a good person. And they forget that there's every other minute of the week that isn't filled with that kind of framework. And so how is it that we're able to live this idea of practice in everyday life? So it moves from practice as something special to practice being the activities that we engage in, even in the most difficult moments. Perhaps our carpool becomes a spiritual process. Perhaps sipping coffee can become a way of gaining greater insight into our human capacities. The point is that we must find ways to live that practice every day. And ultimately, rather than seeing ourselves as virtuous, we become someone who's embodying this as a reflection for others. There is in this process then a move from me, my practice, my own sense of defining self, to a we. And this transformation in worldview is often that shift from my own identification to my identification as something, as part of something bigger than myself. And so from the me to the we becomes an important way in which we take practice and live it. Okay, I set this to give myself 3 extra minutes. So then we go from this idea of life as practice and really beginning to imbue every moment. A friend of mine was Cassie Veaton, who co-authored this book with me. She talked about the little bobble-headed Buddha that people put on their dashboards, and she thought, ugh, that's just such new age nonsense. And then what she realized is that it's so easy for us to forget. And so by people putting little reminders up, whether it's a piece of art or some kind of spiritual insignia, something that reminds us, it can help us to move into that living practice because it is easy to forget. And I think one of the important things about this piece is that it also helps to be in community. So coming together in this cafe, coming together in a rippled out way of cafes in the meta can be very important for us because we become mirrors to one another. We can reflect to one another the values and the intentions that we bring. And when one of us is starting to slip up, we can simply be a model for the other, and vice versa. We change roles. So it's important as we think about the transformative process to know we're not alone and know we can't do this alone. It's really our embeddedness in a broader purpose. So that's the movement from the I to we. The pitfall there is that we can forget about the me. People become so engaged in service that they fail to take care of themselves. And you can't really have a healthy we without a healthy me. And in order to truly be part of this broader whole, it needs that healthy individuation that can ultimately bring itself to service in its fullest capacity. And so this move from the me to the we has to be reciprocal. And the me to the we is nurtured as the me is nurturing the we. Ultimately, we define in our book this notion of living deeply. We can come into a set of understandings, a place of right relationship in our communities, in our families, in our workplace. Everything becomes an opportunity for some kind of transformative worldview experience. I also want to say that where I have come in this work, after 15 years of working on this Living Deeply project, we never mentioned death in the book. And it was funny to me because death is kind of the big transformation. And so what I have devoted my last 3 years to is really looking at how our death awareness can propel our lives in ways that are virtuous and positive. So how do we redefine the fear of death into an inspiration for living? And that's what the new film is about, that's what the new book is about, and ultimately I'm creating some educational programs for health and healing practitioners that will allow them to have greater awareness of their own relationship to death. Often it's accompanied with terror. So with that terror come aberrant behaviors. So as we bring death awareness into the conversation, we can ultimately live our lives with greater purpose, greater empathy, greater opportunity. And then finally, how do we, as the point of our conversation today, bring these insights into our communities? And this Fibonacci spiral is like a fractal, and it's iterative, and it can be applied in any domain of our life. So we can bring it into our healthcare institutions, we can bring it into our schools, we can bring it into our corporations, we can bring it into our communities, we can bring it into our faith practices. It has the potential to help transform not only individuals, but whole systems. And ultimately, we need those systems as containers to help nurture those healthy individuals. So finally, the one thing I've done in this domain is working with my colleagues. We took the insights that came out of this research and created a curriculum. It's 22 lessons called Worldview Exploration. It's designed for high school kids, but is now being applied at college levels, where we're teaching young people about worldview. What does it mean to have one? What does it mean that other people have them? What are the skills and capacities I need to be in right relationship? The social emotional intelligence, the kind of equanimity and balance that are necessary. Self-reflection, these kinds of qualities. And then, so there's the me, there's the we, and ultimately in this curriculum, it's that opportunity to be of service to the world in which we live, because ultimately we do have a lot of challenges. It is easy to see the glass as half empty, and yet we all know that together we've got bottles we can pour in together, and we can create something that is a kind of tipping point. And it doesn't take everybody, it takes a critical mass. And I think that, not everything comes from one cafe like this, but many things can, because each of you goes back into your communities, and each of you has the opportunity to be that stimulus for a new worldview and a new way of honoring each other. I think I'm on time.
Thank you for anchoring this talk. I hope a lot of you also saw parallels, which I did, with making notations of what she was saying. A lot of these things are rooted in Islamic ethos. And if you are conversant and reading Islamic literature, one of our problems is we've gotten stuck in reading that literature in a very literalistic way and not from its conceptual framework, and not taking that and seeing how it actually means value to us. And what you just heard, it parallels a lot of the stuff that we know we practice, but not consistently and not knowingly. And that's very important. So we're going to have questions now for Marilyn. And we want to keep 2 questions. So she's the expert. We're the audience to ask questions. You can make one-line comments, but we want to give everyone an opportunity.
I think everybody's an expert, just so you know.
My question is, and please correct me, for somebody to experience conscious transformation in their life, does the person has to go through something significant or profound or a tragedy in their life, or not necessarily?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. Based on our research, the answer is it's a both and, but the vast majority of people who report these transformations are stimulated by some kind of pain. So it's the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, a divorce, something that disrupts the steady state. It doesn't always have to be that way. You hear people describe Yasir Chadli. He's an imam who lives in Oakland, and he's a mystic, and he had a unitive consciousness experience swimming out in the ocean. So that wasn't painful for him, but it was transformative. But by and large, about 85% of the people in our survey study had some kind of pain as the trigger. So thank you for asking that. So pain can be a great opportunity and a great opening. Well, I believe it can. I believe it's a kind of literacy. And I believe we can learn it. And we can learn the qualities and the characteristics. It's not as though it's going to happen like that, but we know the boundary conditions. And if you think about it as a nonlinear dynamic system, if you can set the boundary conditions and then trigger it with certain catalytic actions, I think that can lead to these kinds of transformations. In our high school curriculum, for example, we're seeing that the kids, it's just really fascinating. I started with 3rd graders. It's now in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grades. But these kids will say repeatedly, we ask them, where does your worldview come from? What is a worldview? Where does it come from? And they think, wow, nobody ever asked me that before. Nobody cared about what I think. Because the educational system, at least in the public system, is very much based on giving you the information. This is much more an inversion of that. It's an invitation to explore our assumptions. And I think that's a skill set that we can teach. Epiphanies, okay.
And you talked about the topic of death and die, playing a role in being that character.
Yes.
And you studied that, and that's probably the main focus of your feature film
Right.
with Deepak Chopra. Can you give us some examples of what came out and what you heard with some of these catalytic conversions that happened because of the very concept of death and dying?
Yeah, there's so much I could say about that right now. It's hard. The film is, again, an overview of different traditions and different perspectives on death and what happens after. So there's a tremendous amount of time spent on what are your models of the afterlife. The theoretical influence, primarily for the book will come out in May, so I had a lot more freedom to have a voice in my own book as compared to a collaborative project in a film where there's a lot of voices. Talk about needing worldview literacy. But what we found is that there is something called terror management theory. It comes out of the work of Ernest Becker, who's an anthropologist, and he wrote a book called Denial of Death that got him a Pulitzer Prize. And in that he said, we all have this core terror, not a fear, a terror of death. Not everyone. There are some who are enlightened and have transcended it, but it becomes a defining experience. And what happens is that terror is repressed. It's below the threshold of our awareness. And what happens is that we can get triggered. We see some reminder of our mortality. And this leads to defensive behaviors. So I become much more protective of my in-group because it's safe for me. And I become much more reactive toward the out-group. Now, social psychologists have done about 1,000 experiments to test this. And it's really true that if you have people who are fearful, you trigger their mortality salience, remind them of their death in a variety of different ways, they become more extremist. They become more fundamentalist. It's been done in Christian fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, Buddhist fundamentalism. You know, they've looked at it in a variety of different settings. So for me, the insight is if you can bring death awareness in a way that helps alleviate the fear, and you can educate people, the new materials that I'm working on are around educating people about different models of death in the afterlife in a way that is compelling and safe. That I think that will reduce that sense of defensiveness and allow people to be more convivial with one another. So I think that becomes a kind of tipping point for a transformative experience. And again, I've just done a little bit of research on a course I taught, and we found significant differences before and after the training in people's language use. And they became much more third-person we than me, significant reduction in the first-person pronoun as a result of this kind of training. So there's some kind of shift to my sense of belonging and my seeing that my experience is much more embedded. And they also had significantly fewer death references. The whole 6 weeks was spent talking about death, and at the end of the course they talked about it less than they did at the beginning. That I thought was really interesting. So I think there's a lot more to be said, and I encourage you to get the movie, show it to communities, have conversations.
Do you think deliberate conscious activity, physical activity, can be conducive to conscious transformation? For example, the movements of the whirling dervishes, Sufis.
Definitely. I think that there's a lot that connects mind, body, spirit. You know, different kind of sutras, the positions, the yogic movements. The dervishes, definitely. There's no question. And that's an interesting practice because a lot of that is about death awareness. I interviewed an imam from Turkey, and he let us come into one of his activities. It was the crane dance. And so everybody was doing the crane dance, men and women. And it was about bringing the bridge, embodying the bridge between earth and heaven. And so it's a very conscious movement that brings our fullness into this kind of awareness and ultimately can be profoundly transformative, can lead to those epiphanies.
How is this similar or different from Maslow's peak experience?
Good. So I think Maslow had the idea of this progression of self-maturation and self-transformation, what do you call it? Self-actualization. The problem is that you, again, get caught. Maslow's work, I think, gets us caught in the I to we dilemma. It becomes about my self-actualization and my development. And he didn't really pursue so much then the broader, Erickson kind of went the next step in that progression of how do I take this individual with this set of gifts into relationships such that it becomes exponential. And I think it's very much informed by Erickson, Maslow, Jung, you know, all that kind of Northern California philosophy is very much part of the book and part of the program. But I think maybe he just didn't go far enough.
Is it in general easier to have a transformative experience if you are exposed to worldviews versus if you're in a homogenous society? And if you're in a homogenous society, how can you actually be exposed, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I don't know. I think we can think about this worldview transformation, you know, in sort of increments. So it's certainly possible for people to have revelation if they're living in a very limited space. But the unique opportunity of this moment in time is this convergence. Because we can't, you know, historically, if a group met with another group and they were different from us, we would diverge, right? We could keep going in another direction and create an encampment over here or a settlement over there. That's not as likely today. Today, we are forced to deal with each other. So you have people of different faith traditions, you have, you know, atheists and Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus all sharing the same grocery stores, all sharing the same schools, living in the same neighborhoods. And what I find fascinating is that it's like we're living in these little discrete bubbles, our little ontological bubbles. And so we're operating in different universes and yet coexisting. And in that process, there is this kind of engagement. It's kind of like a weaving. And I also think with the internet, it's impossible. Anybody who's on the internet, which is most people, even, you know, there's more cell phones than toilets in the world. You know, it's everywhere. People have access. Poor people in the most desolate places have a little cell phone. So we have a new kind of awareness of the other. And in that process, an engagement. So I think that there, you know, I don't think we have to worry too much about the insulation piece because it is just not really an option for many of us anymore. But yes, I think your question is right. It's much easier, and it's much easier if you bring intention. If you bring intention and pay attention, you're much more likely to have this. And that's why the pain piece becomes important, because it actually forces you out of whatever isn't working for you and makes you consider other possibilities. So pain becomes a tremendous gift in that situation.
Yeah, I just had a question about, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, you're talking about personal consciousness and an evolution going into a higher realm or a deeper realm where you're bringing that to community then. But there are a lot of people out there obviously doing a lot for communities, again, for the purpose of a transformational, you know, for a transformational evolution within those communities who have not had these experiences. So, you know, the impacts that people or organizations are having within different communities, you know, in an attempt to transform them towards a better, how different is that from an individual who's had this experience? Essentially, are they not doing the same thing, or do you think this carries more meaning?
I think there's tremendous good work. You know, I just had the opportunity to do a world tour. I visited a variety of different communities who are deeply connected to the idea of transformation. I want to make a little analogy. So you imagine there's a river, and there are these babies floating down the river. And you stand by the river and you scoop them out because you're trying to save them. But you don't take the time to think, where are these babies coming from? Where's the root of the problem? And if you don't get to the root of the problem is going to continue no matter how hard you work, right? So I think consciousness becomes that root problem or root possibility. And as we can begin to reflect on our own worldview, our biases, our assumptions, our purpose, the ideals we wish to embody, I think that becomes the root cause that can ground all of that great social work in a way that has more depth and authenticity.
Excellent presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Kudos. So thank you so much. You mentioned the 5 elements to transformation: inattention, attention, repetition, guidance, acceptance. So in your research, which one was the most difficult for people to, or people struggled with to overcome? And the second question, what advice were you able to give those people to overcome that obstacle?
Acceptance.
Yeah.
Acceptance or surrender. It's really difficult because we are grounded in the idea that our actions can make a difference. Sometimes our inactions can make a difference. And, you know, we want so much to heal. You know, I think transformation is healing, healing is transformation. And so how do we heal in a way that acknowledges, you know, we're not physically changing the world. Well, we are when we build dams and the other things. We can do that. But ultimately, it's about accepting who we are in that position, and in a certain sense being a model that ripples out. So, you know, being okay with what is so, such that we can help to facilitate the betterment of the situation. I think that becomes the tricky place for a lot of people, because we want to do something. And we should do lots of things. But it's also about the being and not the doing. So
my question is actually very similar to Ali's question, and that is, when let's say a person has a noetic experience and they now bring their intention and attention to that, whatever that is. What is the biggest step you think that, let's say, keeps people from progressing forward in that transformative process more? I guess my question is the repetition process. Is there a point where there's a hindrance to growth because of a discouragement within the process where they can't really break through a certain wall? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
George Leonard, who was an Aikido master and actually was the first person to really write about transformation, talked about loving the plateau. You know, you get to a place where it's not changing anymore, but you still have to love to be in that place. But I want to tell a quick story. A friend of mine, Fred Luskin, runs the Stanford Forgiveness Project. And he brought women, mothers, from the Catholic and Protestant contingents from Northern Ireland to Stanford, and he took them through a very detailed emotional intelligence training program. And they've done the same thing with abortion people, like pro-con, brought them together, and these people were really situated in their worldviews, right? And I think the important thing about both these stories is it didn't mean that you had to give up what meant something to you. It didn't mean you had to change your political position. It just meant that you had a space to listen. So these women on the forgiveness study, they came in and they fell in love with each other. They loved each other. They became friends. They cared about each other. They were covering each other's back. And then they went home. And people at home did not like this idea. And so probably the biggest limitation, the biggest barrier, is that, you know, these change agents can have these moments of clarity, go back into the communities that are so deeply entrenched in the problem, and it becomes almost overwhelming. And so that's why I think having these kinds of communities is absolutely essential. And having ways that these communities can ripple out and engage other communities so that we're reinforcing one another, we're empowering each other. It can be very lonely in this process, and I've seen this over and over again. When we did the focus groups with the teachers, many tears. When they were telling their own personal stories, many hardships. So even these teachers who have been on the path for a long time can be very lonely. So how do we find that place of friendship and conviviality? Because it's in that place of meeting with others who will support us on this journey, not necessarily agree with us, but support us in that exploration. I think that is key to helping make the paradigm shift.
Thank you for the excellent talk. You had mentioned that about the fear of death having an important impact in people's lives. If we look at it more broadly, is there can we say that lack of control, lack of knowing what's going to happen in the future is the primary fear that humans might have rather than death fear?
Yeah, Mickey Singer is a friend of mine. He wrote a book called Untethered Soul. It happens to be Oprah Winfrey's #1 favorite book of all time. I'm like, oh wow, Mickey, you are living the dream. Anyway, he says the same thing to me. He's like, Marilyn, the fear of death is really important, but it's the fear of living. It's the fear of being in that surrender place, that acceptance place. Because, you know, we are control freaks, and we want to control and define and manipulate and make safe what is around us. And so it is that yielding to our role in the universe, in whatever form that takes. But I do believe death is a big sort of boogeyman that we're all kind of in denial of, and maybe that becomes a place in which to focus because the other thing is so hard to articulate. But I do think there's something bigger that has to do with the locus of control. It's very much a Western construct, by the way. You know, this idea that we're going to control everything and we're going to have it all situated the way we want it and we're going to manipulate. That comes from the Western worldview and the scientific worldview. You know, the only valid reality is that which we can taste, test, measure, manipulate, and everything else becomes suspect. I think that's the inversion, and that's where the consciousness shift can happen, is as we begin to recognize that these ineffable qualities carry great power, and it's not all about control and manipulation. It's about yielding to what is so. Did that make sense?
Yeah, before that, I have a very quick, I'm just curious, what happened to that businessman? Was he equally successful after the transformation? I mean, his success declined?
Yeah, he ended up becoming a very successful philanthropist, used his money for great purposes. Sadly, he was one of those people that, you know, the Bernie Madoff scandal, he was one of those people who, Bernie absolutely wiped out his entire foundation in a day. He went from, you know, having a huge foundation to nothing. And he also lost a granddaughter who was like 17. She was an Olympics athlete, and she was killed by a car crash. And those two things tested him. And I would say he came out very well. He's more committed than ever to the sense of the good.
I guess the question then was, when you have a transformation at a personal, individual level, does it lead to some negative impact on family life? And how do you come through it, or what kind of guidance or tips you have through your research?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Unfortunately, I mean, we will ask our imam and find out. Let us get answers there. Do you want to touch on? Do you want to touch on?
Fear of death.
Let me interject here. Let me interject a little bit. One, always keep your mic on because we're being videographed, and keep your comments when you have been given this. That means things are getting recorded, otherwise we will miss points. That's one. Two, to add to this, I think one of the fundamental problems as Muslims is that we hear stuff like this and we jump to the idea that we already have all this. That may be the case, but you don't know how it's supposed to be applied. And so we have an application problem and a presumption problem that there's nothing more that we need to learn about a certain subject because we already have that material within our tradition. And so those 5 points, I was trying to look while you were mentioning them, where they fit into the Islamic dictum. And so we know intention is one of the primary things within our tradition, because the collection of the prophetic traditions begins with actually the most famous tradition, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that every action begins with intention. And so any student of Islamic studies and a scholar, actually that's the first tradition that they're trained on. And so with each of these, we have parallels. I think the disconnect is we are stuck in a presumed state of mind that we know this, but it's never our own. And that makes it a barrier to be able to address topics like this and to take something that will be more applicable.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I have follow-up on your example, like you said, a river generating babies who need to be saved. Did you look into how to fix this problem or how to contain this problem? Because we see more and more, looks like there's a problem in the world, but many people want just to manage the situation or the crisis. Nobody interested in treating the root of the problem. They just want to manage it, apparently for their secondary gain. So how do we deal with this? Because there's a lot of people feel overwhelmed, and there's a lot of power on top of them trying to create a lot of babies who need to be saved.
Well, it's a big question, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to explore it, and maybe more time this afternoon. But I think that the reason to feel encouraged is that there are people all over the world who are asking this question. And consciousness is a big topic globally in the most unusual places. I mean, I just was with a group of international leaders in Sweden, and the head of the Club of Rome was there, and people are really interested in the sort of deep issues of consciousness. The whole move right now around social emotional intelligence and Danny Goleman's work and what John Kabat-Zinn is doing, teaching this mindfulness kind of practices in schools, I think that's an excellent opportunity. The one thing I guess, my takeaway in all this is we have to be open, rather than fixed in we have all the answers. And it doesn't surprise me that this would find its roots in this tradition, because the change model came from talking to people of different traditions. So what can excite us is to know that in one tradition it's shared by many other traditions, these common elements. But I think that what I love about the Worldview Literacy Program is the questioning. It's a dialectical process of questioning our assumptions. It doesn't mean you want to refute somebody's worldview. But the hope is that, like, for example, Diana Eck runs the Pluralism Project at Harvard. And it's a deep reverence for the diversity of traditions. It's saying diversity is a demographic fact. Pluralism is the celebration of our differences. And if we can come from that place of celebration and curiosity, then we become less rigid and fixed in whatever our own doctrine happens to be. And so, places like the Parliament of World Religions, where different faith traditions come together to explore not how we all become one big melting pot, but how we can each stand up for what we believe in a way that allows a meeting, an authentic meeting of our differences to celebrate the diversity of our habitat. And that's what I believe is ultimately, what we're being called to. Okay, so this is just a little clip that after this deep and wonderful conversation, it seems a little trite, but it's funny. And we'll end with some humor, and you can just see, can you relate any of this to yourself?
It's just, there's all this pressure, And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
Yeah, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. All of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way. Do I have